Welcome inside Black and Gold. Steve Geller along with Jeff Nowak, and we're coming off the bye week blues after a tough loss in Atlanta, 24-15. Even the score just looks ugly for the Saints in the matchup. And Jeff, I'm glad you're okay, but I know you were busy basically hanging out at the injury tent the entire time in Atlanta.
Man, these last 2 weeks, like 3 weeks, I guess, but these last 2 games, like I feel like, we talked about it, the Saints have had really good injury luck for the first half of the season. It all changed very quickly. Like you finished that game with a worse wide receiver core than you had in 2021. I didn't think that was possible. As you finished that game with, and there's no disrespect to these guys. These are not your wide receivers. You don't have them here to catch passes. And Lynn Bowden, A.T. Perry, and Keith Kirkwood. You're like, they're down 10. They still got a chance. No. The fact that they were able to still move the ball in the second half, like that's one of the things that, like, when Chris Olave went down in that game, and I was like, early in the second half, it's like, oh, this is over. And the fact that they were still able to move the ball, honestly, is pretty impressive when you think about it. But we'll get into it. That was just unpleasant. And it's just, it's like you'd like to say, you'd like to be able to sit here and say, like, oh well, everything went wrong, and this and that, and you were in these really difficult circumstances. But at the end of the day, it's just another example of what we have seen throughout the course of the season, which is just inept red zone offense, mistakes, the turnovers in that game were just, even with all of those problems, you probably still win that game if you don't have those 2 red zone turnovers. Like those are 14 points that you could say that's a 20-point swing in the game potentially, because instead of 2 touchdowns in the red zone, you didn't score any points. Actually, so you could say that that's a potentially a 28-point swing in that game, because instead of 2 touchdowns for 14 points that you could have had, you allowed 2 touchdowns for 14 points on the other end, one directly into it and another one a 95-yard touchdown drive. So like that's a potentially 28-point swing at worst, or at the minimum a 20-point swing. Even if you kicked 7 field goals in that game, like you probably win it if you do. We'll get into it, but I do want to talk. We want to get into the latest injury updates, kind of what you're looking at coming out of that game, because it just seems like everyone was hurt. But here, what are the injuries that you're actually watching? What did we hear from Dennis Allen today? That sort of thing. So we'll get into that. And we also heard from Alvin after the game, and he talked about how his team doesn't have an identity. We'll listen to what he had to say, and then also what Dennis Allen had to say, who does think this team has an identity. And man, it's just like every time he talks, you just kind of get this big eye roll. It's so difficult to take him seriously. And I know that's, like, I just, how many times can you go up there and say the same thing with the same tone? And, maybe it's different internally, but I can understand why people are just like, just stop talking. Just get this man off my TV. So we'll get into that. Second segment, as we've done, we'll do the what didn't work, because there was a lot that didn't work. So that'll be the long segment. And then the final segment, we'll do what did work and kind of reset where the Saints are. They still do control their own destiny, although it is a much, much narrower road than it would have been with a win, which would have, almost guaranteed not guaranteed the division, but like would have put you in a really good position. Now, if you don't win out, I don't know what happens. So we'll get into all that. But, first things first, what were your kind of, watching the game from here? What were your kind of impressions live? How much of a conniption was Bobby throwing throughout the game? That kind of stuff.
Well, obviously, things started out wacky with issues in-house with microphones and the national
There were penalties
anthem
on that opening drive that I still don't know what they are or what they were, because I think there was one that defensive holding that was declined. No friggin' clue.
But with the game, I mean, things started out rough right away, just with injury aspects. With things happen, Rashid Shaheed getting hurt, and you kind of saw him trying to manage through it the entire game. And then I became, watching him going, no, just sit down. I don't want you to get hurt any worse.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that's not the case. obvious with him going forward. We'll find out more when the Wednesday injury report comes out on the quad. Is that what the injury is being listed at as a quad issue?
Quad, thigh, something in that realm.
But the offense, I was impressed, obviously, what Chris Olave was able to do in that first half of action. It was like, holy crap, this is the guy we've been waiting to see. With Mike T down, obviously a hurt Shaheed. It's like, yes, take over the game like we've seen you do in training camp, and we talked all about leading up to this. And then unfortunate, obviously, an injury with him, and then you start obviously to see Derek Carr really struggle in the matchup. And to me, obviously that's understandable when you're down now 1, 2, 3 of your top receivers. But the biggest disappointment was the leakage of run yards that Atlanta was just able to pile up, and it didn't matter who was running the rock, they were getting yardage.
Yeah, and particularly on those last 2 drives, which, you go back and you're like, okay, the defense did handle, I wouldn't say it was great, but it did keep points off the board, right? Like the Falcons scored 7 points in that game prior to the final 2 drives, right? The Falcons defense scored 7 points, which is what made it much more difficult for the Saints.
Yeah.
But the Saints defense allowed 7 points through 3 quarters. And then the final 2 drives of that game, which were in the fourth quarter, they allowed a touchdown, a 95-yard drive for a touchdown, and then a long drive for a short field goal. And that's where you needed the defense to kind of hold up, and they didn't. They forced 2 turnovers, so that helped keep points off the board, right? Like one of those turnovers was at the end of the first half that, they were like, that was a huge mistake by the Falcons in terms of, you're guaranteed 3 points, and they ended up throwing an interception to Tyrann Mathieu, kind of gift wrapped it to him. But yeah, so the run defense, we'll talk more about that, but let's just put a bow. So on these injuries right now, Dennis Allen talked about Rashid's injury. It sounds like it happened on the first play of the game. I know there was some indicator. People were saying that his injury happened on that ball that was thrown behind him. And it's like, no, he was already hurt at that point. Maybe it made it worse. I don't know. But whatever that injury was, it's on the first play of the game. And you got, I felt bad for him because you watch him on the sideline. At one point, I saw him throw his water bottle to the ground. He was on a bike, kind of trying to keep it loose.
I felt for him too, right?
There was a point where Lynn Bowden went down, and it was clear that he's like trying to talk his way back into the game. And Lynn Bowden went down with an injury, and he just immediately jumped up, went and grabbed his helmet and ran over. And you could tell he was trying. It's like, let me in, let me go. And every time he got in there, it looked like he was good for one play, like he was good getting into the play. But then after, it seemed like it was getting worse. And I saw him walk off the field. Marquez Callaway went with him. He had a towel over his head. It's a bummer because, he's a guy who has been very effective and wants to be out there. He's not the type of player that's just going to sit out because he's not feeling right. And he just couldn't go. And, it's hopefully, like you said, hopefully he didn't injure it worse because it doesn't sound like he's going to be back this week based on what Dennis Allen said. I think he said it's got to, however he phrased it, does not sound promising. And that's a problem because you're already without Mike Thomas. Chris Olave went out with a concussion. It was a back shoulder throw, whether that was intentional or not. He got to it, right? He made a play on the ball. AJ Terrell comes back, kind of pushes him out of bounds. And that's where, it's just bad luck in an NFL. Like that's a play that happens in an NFL game all the time. The issue is, his momentum kind of carried him and he flipped over. He landed on his head. Just a freak injury, right? And so now he's in the concussion protocol. And we've seen throughout this season that it's difficult to get back in 1 week from the concussion protocol, particularly for Chris, because this is not his first concussion. He had one his rookie season. And so that, makes it a little bit, more significant in terms of the hurdle to clear. So there's
who do we have left?
Right, exactly. There's a chance they go into this game without Mike Thomas, Marshawn Lattimore, but Rashid Shaheed or Chris Olave.
What?
So you're talking about Marquez Callaway, A.T. Perry, Keith Kirkwood, John Trey Kirkland. He's a guy on the practice squad. Maybe you go sign Traquan Smith off of the Denver Broncos practice squad and see what happens, right?
Take it back.
I don't know.
Take it back.
But this has now become one of the reasons that loss to the Falcons is so damaging is now the week 13 against the Lions starts to feel like a must win. Like we're going to talk about how Saints control their own destiny, quote unquote. Well, that's only true if you can go beat the Lions or beat the Lions when you host them, and that's going to be tough to do without any of your skill position players. Maybe this is a Jimmy Graham experience week. I don't know, but yeah, right. Yeah, it's not good. It's not, and they're not like it seemed like every other place someone was going down with an injury. So just a list. Lynn Bowden, we mentioned he got hurt at one point. Alante Taylor came off the field at one point. I don't know what he was dealing with. Maybe he caught a cramp or something. He was chasing down Desmond Ridder, which Mike Haas the entire game kept calling Da Ritter, which was hilarious to me. So he came off the field, but he ended up being fine. Like he came out of the tent, kind of did some backpedaling. They made him like test it out. And it worked. So maybe he just caught a cramp and they got lucky. Juwan Johnson left the field, went back to the locker room at one point for a concussion test. Clearly, he cleared the concussion protocol and came back in. Eric McCoy left at one point. Saw him with his shoulder pads off, so it must have been a shoulder thing he was dealing with. Ryan Ramczyk came off the field at one point, but apparently it was a shoe issue. So nothing really significant there. And Cam Jordan was the other guy who left the game and didn't return, but I don't know if he would have returned. It's tough because it was late in the game. I don't think they got back on the field. That was that last drive for the field goal. He's dealing with an ankle issue, Dennis Allen said today. It was initially reported as a shin. Jamal Williams also came off the field late with what looked like a shoulder issue. I mean, I think that's it, but it's and like after last week where you had basically the same thing, right? You had Mike Thomas, you had Marshawn Lattimore, Alante Taylor came off the field at one point. It was like every other play, someone was in the injury tent, and then you end up having to have people wait outside the injury tent because someone's already in there.
Right. That's when things are really gone to shit when that stuff's happening.
Yeah, it's just not good. It's not good, and it all kind of crystallizes into what was this team's identity before the injuries, and then. I don't even know what it is now. And, we talked to Alvin Kamara after the game and, he talked about, it's like, does this team have an identity, and it doesn't seem like they do. And here's what he had to say.
We don't have an identity as a team. We're a team that says we want to do and we don't do. And it shows. We're consistently inconsistent.
Do you mean that overall or as an offense?
We're consistently inconsistent. Everybody with a fleur-de-lis on their body and on their head, we're consistently inconsistent. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying as a team.
Consistently inconsistent.
And so do you think that includes like the training staff and the equipment managers? I don't know. Because they have fleur-de-lis on. Just saying. It sounds like he's lumping everybody in.
Everybody. Shoot, I'm in trouble right now. Somewhere.
You have fleur-de-lis?
No, it just says Saints, I think, on here. I think I'm safe.
Yeah, that doesn't count. Sorry, yeah, that doesn't count. You're not included.
Good, all right.
You have missed. But, he kept saying need to do and stopping there. And it's like, I don't know if he need to do more, need to do better. But
well, because he was also talking about the need to do instead of the talk. He's sick of the talking, he was saying.
Right. He's tired of hearing people say, we've got to be better. And then it's like, but what are you going to do? What's your plan
about it? Right.
And I think it's like this. You hear one of the reasons that whenever Alvin talks, it's very poignant is because he's saying a lot of the stuff that everyone has been saying. And it's like, yeah, I agree. You need to be better. We all know you need to be better. So when are you going to be better? Like what are you going to change to be better? And right now, it just seems like that's all lip service. That's because what's changed? What are you changing? Like they should have changed offensive coordinators a month and a half ago. They're not going to do it now because if they were going to do it, they would have done it. But every time.
But the Panthers, they made radical changes. Why can't we?
I was just about to get into, right? And you see, like the Steelers, they make changes, and they have some improved play on offense. The Bills make changes. It looks like their offense is kind of getting on track a little bit. The Panthers fired Frank Reich, although I almost think like that has something to do with him just like sending David Tepper angry texts every time CJ Stroud throws a touchdown pass, right? I don't know. Just like maybe he forced his hand there a bit because that's all. Like if I was in Frank Reich's position and I'm sitting at 1-11 watching CJ Stroud look like a future MVP as Bryce Young, can't even see over his offensive line. I would probably not let that ride either, because it's like, think about like, how do you get fired as a head coach? Well, in part because things fall apart in terms of the relationship between you and your owner. And how does a relationship between you and your owner fall apart? Well, probably because your owner calls you up and be like, "What the hell's going on? Why are we so bad?" And you're like, "We have Bryce Young, you."
Right.
You didn't let me draft my quarterback.
The guy you wanted.
Yeah. And you can't fire the owner. So someone's got to go. Like, when that relationship sours, the owner is not going to sell the team. Right. So there's only one option, and it's fire the coach. And so, like, that's why, one of the reasons that I don't think the Saints are losing this locker room. I don't think the relationships within the locker room are not fraying the way that I think a lot of people outside the locker room might assume they are. Right. You see on Twitter, it's like, oh, DA's going to lose the locker room. I don't think players dislike playing for DA. I almost wish they disliked it more, because like, I feel like some of them are just too comfortable, right? Like, I think like there isn't necessarily this idea that their feet are held to the fire. But
I do think there's something there, though, because when Alvin spoke, he mentioned the fact that he's like, wait a minute, the players, everything's cool with the players right now in the locker room,
I don't think that's here. I have that answer right here.
Okay.
I feel like we good. Like I said, I'm playing for them dudes. When you lose a locker room, I feel like there's some miscommunications or misunderstandings between players, and there's none of that. There's none of that going on. So there's no loss of a locker room in that aspect of what you're saying as far as players go.
As far as players go, so I don't know. I was left to interpret a little more there.
Well, so I do get tired of the amateur behavioral psychology on Twitter, because like that's a good example of, I think Alvin. It's like, you listen to Alvin enough and you kind of understand where he's coming from and what his reactions are and why his demeanor is the way it is. And I think when he's talking about the players, it's because he is a player. And like later in the interview, he was asked, how would you fix things? And he said, "Well, I'm a coach. I'll talk to you about that." Right. And I think he's very cognizant of, this is my lane. This is what I do, and I can control what I can control. He said that about 12 times. And he's not going to go out there and tell you the coaching staff is this or that or this or that. He's going to tell you that from a player perspective, from the interpretation that he has with his teammates, that's not something that he's concerned about. Right. And so like, this was something that, over the week, there was a question asked by, Matt Paris, the new NOLA.com beat reporter, and he asked him like about Derek Carr, and Alvin kind of gave a pause and then gave kind of a generic answer. And it's funny because like this whole amateur behavioral psychology bullshit, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, he must hate Derek Carr. Otherwise, he would have given this super, a different answer, or he wouldn't have paused, and that pause said everything." And, no disrespect to Matt, who I think has done a very good job. He's just kind of coming in midstream here. The reaction from Alvin, it was, you can kind of read it in his face, is, "Well, that's a dumb fucking question." And that's why he paused. And, it's funny because I know this because he said that. Alvin, he was actually replying to me because I was like, I think people are reading too much into this. And I didn't want to call out the question, but like, that was kind of my thought, is that he just kind of thought it was a dumb question. And it took him a second to just kind of like,
Right. And that was the attitude people were picking up. It was this disgust in what he was being asked. It was like, really?
I don't think it's even, disgust. It's just like, well, that's kind of dumb. And that's like when he quoted my tweet and said it was just because like Derek was never gone, right? Like he was throughout the whole week. Everyone knew he was going to play. So it wasn't like there was like this, oh, who's going to be our quarterback? Like they all knew. And so that's an example of like, sometimes it's just don't assume what you don't know. Right? Like you can only, you're just observing. I had someone be like, "Well, you have to pay attention to what the body language is telling you." And it's like, I do pay attention, but the reaction you have is based on 29 seconds of video. And I think I've said this before on the podcast. One of my concerns is that Alvin's going to check out, right? And throughout the season, I think you have seen him get a little bit more, I can only do what I can do kind of, early on, it was a very a much more, I don't want to say eager, but it was a much more kind of urgent type emotional reaction to things. And over the last month, it feels like that's been more subdued, especially in the middle of the week. And so that's my concern. I don't think Alvin is gonna throw his teammates under the bus, and like that's what people thought he was doing with that Derek Carr quote. But
He did say
it is a situation where
he's been frustrated in the past, but this is the most frustrated he's been in his career. And obviously, you hate hearing that right now. And the fact is too, the team and Alvin are just as frustrated, obviously, as the fans are. You hear him too. It's like, listen, if you could point this camera at me and tell me what the fix is, that's easy, but that's not the problem right now. It's like we don't know what the fix is, and all you can do is grind away and work at it. And I get that, and I know fans don't necessarily want to hear it, but I have to rely on a guy like Alvin as one of the leaders on this team, and hearing from him as wanting to steer this team in the right direction too. And I know he mentioned keeping spirits up because it's easy to get in that dark place right now when things aren't going right.
Yeah, and I haven't like I said, like there is a lot of observation that goes on throughout the course of a season, and I don't report a lot of it, right? Like we're not allowed to report a lot of the stuff that we see in the locker room or I see on the plane, right? Like that's part of the deal. Is I'll give you access, but you're not, that's just not. There's an expectation that you're not, there's certain things that you're not talking about, right? And so a lot of it is just kind of see how players interact with each other and kind of, and I have not seen any notable shift in emotion or in like I think that this team is just like when Alvin says that I believe him in terms of they are still playing for each other, and it's not about that. It's just about success and failure, and there's been too much of that. The interesting thing is Dennis Allen was asked about the identity thing on Monday press conference, and he thinks that this team does have an identity. And I think a lot of people would be interested to hear that quote. So here it is.
Yeah, look, I think obviously that's probably a better question for Alvin to answer instead of me trying to speak for him. I think I wouldn't say that we don't have an identity. I thought we came out in the game. I thought we ran the ball effectively. I thought we were able to get the ball down the field effectively. We made some critical mistakes, but if we don't make critical mistakes in those situations, we're probably having a different discussion up here.
What do you think the team's identity is then, if you feel differently than he does?
Well, I think we have explosive players on offense. I think we've proved that we can be explosive on offense. Defensively, I think we do a really good job of taking the football away. There's some areas in both phases and all three phases that we have to improve on. But I think we have a fast, explosive offense, and I think we have an opportunistic defense.
And I think I tweeted that quote. People are going to just like collectively roll their eyes, like talked about. Like I think it's really easy to just roll your eyes at that. But the funny thing is, he's not wrong in the sense that this team does generate a lot of explosive plays. They're tied for the NFL lead with 9 plays of 40-plus yards. In that game alone, they had 6 plays of 20-plus yards. They move the ball. They generate explosive plays. The problem is you don't generate explosive plays into the end zone. We were talking about this before we came on. Like there's not a lot of explosive plays that end up as touchdowns. And then if you're not finishing off those plays, then it doesn't really mean a ton, right? Like kicking field goals is not going to get the job done. On the other side of that, opportunistic defense. Yes, you do have an opportunistic defense. You're tied for 4th in takeaways with 20. You had 2 in that game, but you talk about opportunistic. The difference in that game is the Falcons got 2 takeaways and they got 14 points off those takeaways. The Saints got 2 takeaways. You know how many points they got off those takeaways? 0. And
the pick 6 was the gut punch, and then the Taysom fumble was just a slice in the throat.
The pick 6 was bad, and both of them were Jesse Bates. And you talk about, return on investment. They spent a lot to bring in Jesse Bates. You could argue that he was the difference in that game. And you would be right. I mean, very clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, he saved them 14 points and he generated, I guess you could say he didn't, you don't know if they would have scored. They probably might have gone over 7 in the red zone or whatever. But, he saved at least 6 points and he generated 7 on his own. And, that play on Derek Carr, it's funny because there's a lot of criticism of Derek Carr. And I think he's right in the fact that, like, you're just going on rules, right? When you're running an offense, you're saying, okay, if we get this look, we're going here, right? If the receiver wins, I'm throwing it there. And Jesse Bates he's playing single high. His job is to make sure nothing gets there. But he read the eyes and he broke on it so early that, like, Derek didn't even know he was there. And
he was in Derek's head. It was crazy.
It's funny because in most cases you'd be like, well, that's, the dangerous throws, the throws that would typically turn into a 90-yard pick six, or the throws to the edges of the field where the outside corner is breaking on the ball. A throw to the middle of the field, you would think, that's not a pick six throw. But, when you're in that compressed area, he's able to do that, right? If that play is from the 40 and he's playing single high, no way is he going to be able to break on it because it's too far away. But because you're in that kind of compressed area, he was. And, that's why it's a pick six, because he's got a full head of steam when he catches it. You're not getting him. But, it was a great play by him. And, it's like, you look at things, it's like, okay, when you're evaluating a quarterback, it's like, what could he have done differently? And I think the coaches are going to look at it and be like, it's the right read. He just beat him. And that's frustrating. Cause do you call a different play? Do you run a play differently? I don't know. But at the end of the day, the Falcons were the opportunistic team in that game. Right. And the Saints were not.
I mean, yeah, the Tyrann Mathieu tried to will the team back into things as much as he could, but damn it, the Saints just didn't want to do anything with those footballs. Forget it.
And it's so frustrating. Like that Taysom Hill fumble. Like I asked DA, it's like, well, why don't you just just let the clock run out and go to the fourth quarter and just run your best play, your 1st and 10. And, it's like, it's hindsight, right? The play worked. The play that they ran worked. So the theory was we're going to catch them on their heels. The play worked. It was a 10-yard run down to the 7, but Jesse Bates punched it out. And it's like if that goes differently, right? If he just goes down, if he just protects the ball and goes to the ground, you get 1st and goal from the 7. You either, you're down 2. It's 14-12 at that point. You could kick another field goal and take a lead, even if you don't get in the end zone. But if you pay that off for 6, I guess you would be it would have been 19-14, which I guess you would then go for 2. No, it would have been 18-14. So I guess you probably would go for 2 to get up 6 because you had 2 field goals rather than being up 5, which I don't think does anything for you. Worst case, you're up 4. So, it's really it's hard to even kind of quantify how much of a game changer that was.
Yeah.
In part because the defense wasn't able to come up and get a stop, get you the ball back, and then lie a 95-yard touchdown drive. Black. But yeah, and it's just, like, what is the identity of this team? The identity of this team is close but no cigar. Is we do a lot, consistently inconsistent, right? Like you generate a lot of yards, you move the ball between the 20s, you get chunk plays. Heck, even Lynn Bowden had a chunk play. You had 2 really nice Lynn Bowden plays. Juwan Johnson had a chunk play in that game. Chris Olave had at least 2 in the first half, right? He was on pace to have a monster game. Like he had a season high in the first half with 114 yards on 7 catches.
My fantasy alerts were going crazy.
Yeah, he was good. He was going to have a monster game. But your identity right now is a team that has failed at every possible opportunity that has been gift wrapped for you. And, like whether you want to say this is you want to put a rosy picture on it and say, well, it's this and that. It's right now it's a failure in a situation where there's no excuse for it. And so, yeah, and the frustrating part is you like you mentioned, Tyrann Mathieu. Like, I don't think Ritter had a good game. I think Ritter had a bad game. But you didn't force him to have a good game to beat you. Anyway, but I guess we can wrap up that segment unless you got something else you want to add.
No, we can definitely move on to the next part of the torture of the, this post week podcast. It's just, I really thought, man, that they're going to get their shit together and come out with this energy, this fire, because it was for that extra oomph in the division, and that you could stomp a little bit of domination over an opponent. And no, that's just not the case. Misery.
Yeah, ugly. But all right, this is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He's Steve Geller. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. We're going to be here for the next 6 weeks, whether you like it or not. So might as well subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. But all right, we're going to hit the break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about what didn't work. It's going to be another long segment because there was a lot that didn't work. But we're going to start from the top down. We're going to hit it that way. But all right, stick around on Inside Black and Gold. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He's Steve Geller. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Hit me up on Twitter, unless you're one of the people that's already been mean to me on Twitter, in which case, go ahead, keep doing it. We're going to talk about Derek Carr. We're going to talk about stuff that didn't work, and the first thing is going to be Derek Carr. And the funny thing is, like,
I'm sure folks are mean to him on Twitter.
Yeah. It's funny. He talked about that. He was asked, like, how do you block out the noise? And he's like, yeah, like when he started in the league, it was just like, yeah, you go play football and you go home and you might read something in the paper, or you might, but you're not worried. You're not thinking like, oh, man, like my mentions are a cesspool.
My trending,
now.
Right.
I'm gonna have to put up a sponsored Instagram post, and the brand's gonna be like, we can't advertise with you. Look at these replies. And it's funny because it is a different part, especially the younger players who come up who just have dealt with that their whole lives, and they're they are active on social media. Like
right.
Mike Thomas is tweeting during the game, which, come on, Mike, don't tweet during the game. That's just I don't like that. Mike can do what he wants to do. He's on injured reserve.
You get in trouble with that.
I don't like the tweeting during the game thing. I really don't. Because it's like you're gonna say stuff and people are gonna take, like you talked about the behavioral analysis thing,
right?
Like people are gonna take it a certain way. They're gonna assume whatever you say is gonna, he's subtweeting Derek Carr, he's doing that.
Yeah,
stuff with that. Like if you're like, the coaches have to be like, Mike, you're not helping anybody. Like if you want to tweet about the Ohio State game, I'll go for it. Do what you want to do during the Saints game. Come on, man. Even if you're tweeting about something else, people are going to take that. You tweet rap lyrics, but people are going to try to interpret it, and it's just going to be extra noise that doesn't have. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. Why are we talking about that? But yeah, it's ugly to talk about Derek Carr in any way on Twitter. And one of the frustrating things for me, it's like not every bit of toxic groupthink ideology is correct, but if you try to challenge any of it, then you got people, saying awful things. I've blocked several people. I don't block a lot of people, but if you think like special needs jokes is funny on social media, I'm going to block you immediately, right? Like I'm going to, because that's not okay, right? And like there's this idea that you can just be as abusive as you want to people, and because you're a fan of this team, that's acceptable. And it's like, you can be mad about the result, but man, the level of toxicity on social media, just the people who disagree with you on a very specific thing, like whether throwing a back shoulder ball to a receiver 40 yards down the field, intentional or not, is guaranteed to get them hurt. That's kind of my takes. Like that's just a play in the game. That's a play that happens a dozen times during the course of a week, and Chris Olave landed on his head, and it's a freak accident. Like there's examples of terrible throws in that game. There's one to Rashid Shaheed that is objectively a terrible throw, but it's not, I don't know. It's never that simple. And it's funny because I tweeted that and I was like, I think people are overreacting to this play in terms of its role in getting Chris Olave hurt. And people are like, well, he must be a Derek Carr stan and this and that. It was like,
yes, Derek Carr said, let me get my number one receiver hurt.
So stupid. I will read you the paragraph that I wrote for my take on the Derek Carr situation on the internet. It's documented. You can go find it. And I'm quoting myself because people seem to think that I just have no indication of whether Derek Carr has been good or bad. I'm just standing for it regardless. I say Carr simply hasn't shown that he can elevate this offense, and it's getting more and more difficult to endorse the idea of this being more than a one and done project. You should be, at the very least, seeing signs of an identity and growth from this team. You've seen a lot of mostly empty yards. That's about it. This game, while being a bit unique in the sense of all the adverse circumstances you encountered, is just the latest installment in a season of misses. First of all, I think that's well written. Go me. Second of all, like it is possible to have a more complex take than this guy sucks, get him out of here. Like there is more going on than just Derek Carr not being good enough. But all that said, Derek Carr has not been good enough. And that is a fact. Like you can look at it and say, okay, they're doing some things better than they did earlier in the season. You can look at it and say they have generated a bunch of chunk plays. You can look at it and say, Rashid Shaheed has been a weapon. They've utilized him well down the field. There's a lot of things you can point to and say this isn't all bad. But at the end of the day, you brought in Derek Carr for a reason. And right now, that doesn't look like a good reason. And so you look at this game and you say, what about this game was different in terms of what he has struggled with all year? And at the end of the day, it's just the same in different ways, right? Whether it's turnovers, whether it's penalties, whether it's missed opportunities, the Saints have not gotten the job done in the red zone, and Derek Carr has not been a good red zone quarterback his entire career.
More facts right there.
And so you look at it and you say, okay, I don't think they're going to make any changes. I don't think this team would be better off with Jameson at quarterback. It would just be a whole different set of challenges that you're trying to figure out. But like the question to me, it's like, you're not looking at this and saying, okay, do changes need to be made? You're looking at this and saying, you go into the offseason. It's like not whether changes need to be made. It's how broad and sweeping do those changes need to be? Are you clearing out the entire coaching staff and trying to start fresh with Derek Carr at quarterback? Are you clearing out the offensive coordinator and trying to install a new offense around Derek Carr at quarterback? Are you trading up and maybe going to get a quarterback and saying Derek Carr is your bridge because you're going to have a hard time moving on from him anyway? My point is, there's more nuance to it than just saying everything Derek Carr does is terrible, and even talking about it in measured, non-emotional ways means that you are in the bag for Derek Carr. I had someone say, you want to stay on Derek Carr's Christmas list. And, in fairness, I bet that's a pretty fire Christmas list. I bet the Carrs give out some pretty baller gifts. I'm just saying, it just seemed like that type of family. I also had someone who said something nice to me on Twitter, which almost never happens. And someone replied to us that I was replying to my own tweets from a burner account. And it's funny because like I probably would think the same thing because everyone's so mean on Twitter that like the idea that someone says a compliment, it was just so outlandish. And I replied, I was like, no, if that was me in my burner account, which I don't even have a burner account, I use our podcast account as my burner account. But if that was me, I would have been way meaner to me. So yeah. Anyway, that's just a rant. But you know what? Like Derek Carr hasn't been good enough. We can just say it. We can be clear. He has not been good enough, and this team is struggling in a lot of ways, and it starts with him. And I don't know if it's going to get better as long as he's there. But at the end of the day, you got to watch it and you got to look at it and figure out what's going wrong in order to fix what's going wrong. And unless you can do that in a way that is more meaningful than this guy sucks, get him out of here, it's not analysis. It's just yelling. And that's
there was a part in the game I felt a little bad for Carr, obviously, when you're without Thomas, boom, Shaheed's limping around. Then Olave goes out of a concussion. It's like, well, who the heck is left? Yeah, it felt like last season when you're like, who the heck's left on this receiving core to throw to?
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's funny because you want to be able to say, well, this game went a certain way because of that. And the problem is you can't, because the issues existed when all three guys were healthy, and they existed when all three guys weren't healthy. They did move the ball even after those guys went out. So it does give you at least some reason to think when they get out there on Sunday against the Lions, they will have some options, right? Like they're not dead in the water without those 3 receivers, but it changes your offense entirely in terms of what you're going to do. And it's going to force Pete Carmichael to get creative. And we know that hasn't been the recipe for success so far this season.
Can we hope for a miracle of miracles in the concussion protocol?
It's possible, right? Like, who knows? It's tough because it's a second concussion.
Yeah, I hear you there.
And they're not gonna be more lenient on Chris just because the Saints are that desperate at wide receiver.
But
right?
we need them.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to sway them. I think Zach Ewing, who does the kind of one-on-one with Derek Carr every week, they talked about like the concussion protocol and like you have to you memorize certain things and repeat them back, and like there's quizzes like that. And he's at one point, Derek was like, "I don't know the answer to that question, but if you could have asked me 2 weeks ago, and I wouldn't have known it then either." Right? So it's like it's not a simple process to clear those neurological exams. Are, it's not like you can cheat, not like you can study for them. Like you kind of just got to do them. Although maybe because he's been through it before, maybe he's got a head start on what to expect. Anyway,
fingers crossed for Olave.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next topic in terms of what didn't work, because it wasn't just Derek Carr. The offense, obviously, there's a lot to talk about. We can talk about a lot of it, but there was another thing that didn't work, and that was the run defense. And if you're a 4-3 defense that can't stop the run, you're a bad defense. That's like the whole point of a 4-3 defense is to be able to kind of gunk up the middle of the field.
They looked far from elite in this game. Looked far from elite.
No, well, I mean, like again, they kept points off the board, but that wasn't because they stopped the run. It was because Tyrann Mathieu came up with 2 very timely interceptions.
Yeah.
And you look at it, Bijan Robinson had his way all game. What you can say is you didn't allow any huge runs. Like you didn't allow any like 30, 40 yard runs, but there was a lot of 10 to 15 yard runs in that game. And those are just body blows. And you saw those really, I mean, did they throw the ball on that last drive for a field goal? I don't think they did. And you were only really able to stop them once they got into field goal range, and they really just kind of compressed everything to make sure that nothing crazy happened, because a field goal basically won them the game there. But again, it's like one of the reasons you struggle to contain mobile quarterbacks, right, is because you have these big, bulky defensive ends. You're built to stop the run, and when you're not doing that, and you have these corners on the outside. I thought the corners played pretty well, right? I think. Even without Marshawn, I thought you locked down pretty well on the outsides, but you didn't force them to have to beat you on the outsides. And so your advantage is gone when all they have to do is run a trap play up the middle, on these zone run. Like that's a problem. And like you're going to play this team again in week 18, and that could be a game where the winner goes on to the postseason. And what's going to change? Like what's different than you saw this week? It's like you're healthy on the defensive line. You're healthy in the linebacker core. So
Nathan Shepard and Colin Saunders, I'm sorry, not getting the job done for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Cam Jordan, right? Like one of the things I'll say about Cam Jordan typically is like, I think if you're obsessed about the number of sacks, then you're never going to be satisfied with Cam Jordan's performance, because he's always been a run first defensive end, and he will always be a run first defensive end. But in order for the value there to make sense, you have to also stop the run. And in a game where they had 41 rushing attempts, if you include the scrambles, he had one assisted tackle the entire game. And it's like, if you're going to say, well, I stop the run first and then I worry about I play the run on the way to the quarterback, and they ran 41 times. They didn't run away from you. They're not running away from Cam. They're not running at Carl Granderson. Right. And so like where was your impact in that game? It just wasn't there. It's like if your stars are not playing like stars on defense, and you're having this inconsistency on offense, that's a problem. And so, that run defense, you're not going to face the Falcons every week. You're not going to face a team that wants to pound the ball like that every week, but you are going to face them again. And I saw nothing to close out that game that told me that when they meet again in 6 weeks, you're going to see a different result. So I don't know if if you got to have kind of a come to Jesus, if you got to figure out a way to do something different. Maybe Peyton Turner gets back. He did travel with the team. Maybe he, as a kind of an athletic interior player, maybe he helps in that regard. Maybe JPP can continue to have an impact. He did play. I thought he played reasonably well, but that's a problem. And if you can't fix it, then there's really nothing to talk about.
Last year, obviously, was like, all right, we need to make a change, and the change really hasn't done anything up front on the D line so far this year, and it's sad to see when the run defense was such a strength just a couple years ago, but it's deteriorated so rapidly.
Go back to, I think, week 15 in 2020, the game you went up and faced the Eagles. Going into that game, the Saints had not allowed a 100-yard rusher in like 3 seasons. The last time it was like Samaje Perine in that game against Washington that the Saints came back from like 10 points down, if you remember that game, and they won it in overtime. I remember that game vividly because I turned it off. and I looked at the score. I was like, whoa, what? Anyway, it's the type of thing that this Saints team definitely isn't going to do this year, right?
Right.
In that game, the Eagles the Eagles not only had a 100-yard rusher, they had 2 of them because Miles Sanders and Jalen Hurts both did it. And, it's like, it felt like at the time, I was like, well, that's kind of an anomaly. Now it feels like that happens way too often. In this game, you actually didn't allow a 100-yard rusher, but you came pretty close. Bijan Robinson had 91 yards on 16 carries. That's 5.7 yards per carry. He had a touchdown. Tyler Algier, 64 yards on 10 carries at 6.4 yards per carry. Cordero Patterson, 43 yards on 8 carries. It's 5.4 yards per carry. I mean, you can't allow an average of 5.6 yards per rush. And again, that's a very true number. That's not a number that is influenced by, okay, they had 180. Like, you go back to the Colts game and you're like, well, their yards per carry looks a lot better because they had a 40-yard run from Zach Moss and a 44-yard run from Jonathan Taylor, and the rest of the game, you kind of stifled them. No, there were no long runs in this game, right? Bijan Robinson's long run was 17. Tyler Algier's long run was 14. Cordell Patterson's long run was 12.
Kicked away, right.
Desmond Ritter's long run was 16. So that 5.6 is very much representative of what happened all day long. And so, yeah, I mean, like, to me, it's like you can, pick your poison, right? What is your biggest concern? You went into this season hoping the Derek Carr offense could be dynamic and be better than we've seen. But, the idea was this season, it's like you're really just trying to get that offense to a point that it can support a dominant defense.
Right.
The idea was never we are going to have a top 3 offense and then the defense is just going to be able to sit around and do whatever it wants. You would hope, but the point was the whole idea of kind of keeping this going was you have a championship caliber defense and you don't want to waste it.
Right.
And based on what we have seen through 12 weeks, I think this is an average defense at best.
Right, an average defense that's definitely been fortunate enough, thankfully, at creating turnovers, which has made them a lot more, I guess, scarier to deal with than really you'd think. Because other than that, there's nothing. The stopping the run is a huge issue, obviously, when it just spills over now, even gets magnified more, I'll say, with whatever quarterback being back under center, being able to take off. And Ritter didn't kill the Saints, but it was still 11, 12-yard run to pick up a first kind of deal. That it was like that little nibble, and they just kept nibbling away with the run game, which worked. And the Saints just have not shown the ability, one, to stop the run, or I guess it got better this game, their ability to pound the rock more, but it still felt like The Taysom Hill stat, I'll say we got to that, but I was like almost forced to say, we got the 7 carries and we didn't get the win.
Yeah. No, right. Well, it's funny like that. I call it the 7 for 7 stat. So what they're 17-2 now or whatever it
Right.
was when he gets up. The funny thing is like he did get to that number, and if not for that fumble,
right,
that probably is the reason you won. And so realistically, it's like you look at that and say like that it doesn't prove the stat wrong. It actually proves the stat right because you were one it's just like a freak punch out play. But his involvement got you there. It got you to the point where you felt like, oh, 1st and goal from inside the 10.
Right.
This is where you take control of this game. So I don't know. I had somebody say like they benched him after that play, and I don't think that's necessarily true. He doesn't play every offensive snap anyway. I think he only had 25 snaps. Like he's in certain packages. So when you're down 2 scores, you're not running those packages as frequently. And the thing is, like, I think if the defense went in there and got the ball back for the offense and you were in decent field position and you just had to, again, go down and go score to take the lead, I think you would have seen more Taysom Hill, even like the fumble isn't the reason you didn't see him again. But the problem is the Falcons got the ball at their 5, drove 95 yards for a touchdown. Suddenly, instead of being down 2, you're down 9 and you got to score twice. And so you don't have the luxury of pounding away and trying to, churn out some first downs. Like I said, it's not a situational part of your offense. Well, when you're that late in the game, down 2 scores, you do have to abandon some of what you probably had in your game plan. But I think, I don't think that not, my point is the stat now being wrong, I don't think is an indicator that the stat is wrong. Does that make sense?
I got what you're saying. Right.
Like, I think the reason the stat is the way it is because when you do that, it typically means you are succeeding and, you're controlling the ball. And that is what you did on that drive.
Well, I think Triplett responded with the fact that now they're 15-1 when he's got 8 carries.
Yeah, that's why it was always kind of a dumb number because it's so arbitrary. I still think like the 40, I think the total rushing yards is a better number. Although I'm sure there's a better number you could find of like total yardage. But no matter what, this game will be an aberration because Taysom had a huge game, right? He had 7 carries for 26 yards. He had 2 carries for 55. I'm sorry, 2 catches for 55 yards. One of them was a 36-yard.
Man, that grab was amazing.
Right. And so like he had an impact in this game and you just lost it. But a couple other things before we go, and we don't have to harp on it. Another thing that didn't work was A.T. Perry's brain
malfunction, right?
Well, it's funny because I listened to the Deuce, the spot you did with Deuce, and Deuce said he thought he just forgot the play. I think based on what Dennis Allen said and what Derek said, he thought he false started and he expected a penalty to be thrown. And that's why he didn't go. But like, even if that's the case, you got to go until the refs stop you. Right? Like you can't assume they're going to throw a flag, we've seen the refs screw up. We know the refs aren't going to get everything right. Like there's a 2-point conversion against the Vikings. Half the offensive line false started. They didn't call it. Like they're not going to call it every time. And you can't bail on a play because you think you false started. Like
Very
worst case,
right?
You're running that play and then apologizing afterward because I'm sorry I screwed up, but we got another chance. Not running that play. And, some people ask, oh, well, why would you run it to him in that situation? So they're doubling inside. You have your 6'5" wide receiver getting one-on-one. It wasn't AJ Terrell. I can't recall who was in coverage, but like that's a matchup he's here to exploit. That makes sense. He's on the field. He's got to be an option in certain situations, and they're daring you to throw to him. And he has an advantage. If you put that fade up there and he can go get it, we saw him do it against the Vikings. Like he can go up and get a ball. So like I don't think like again, it's just an example of like we're gonna say that's on Derek Carr, we're gonna say that's on Pete Carmichael. A.T. Perry, you gotta be better than that. You gotta understand your job, you gotta do it. And in terms of his opportunity to kind of cement a role, now it doesn't matter because you don't have any other wide receivers anyway, so his role is gonna be he's gonna have a role. You don't really have an option anymore. But
right.
In terms of the confidence of the quarterback, he didn't get another target in that game until the final drive. So, that's like, you hear this with Aaron Rodgers, and, I know Randall Cobb was on the Jets for the sole purpose of explaining to the wide receivers, if Aaron doesn't like you, he's not going to throw you the ball. Like, trust is important. You got to trust guys to be where they're supposed to be. And with a rookie, that's always tough. And so, I give AT a little credit because he did save a possession when Derek got the ball kind of knocked out in a scramble, and he was just Johnny on the spot and collected it. And he's not going to get much credit for that in the stat sheet, but it did save a drive, so he does deserve credit there. And, he's a rookie. You're not going to hold it against him too much. It's disappointing that he wasn't able to at least give himself a chance to take advantage of that opportunity. The other thing is, so why did Derek throw the ball anyway, even though he didn't run the route? Well, when you're throwing a fade, that ball comes out early. You got to get it out early because you gotta loft it. You got to get it to the spot with enough trajectory. And so you're not sitting there watching and seeing if the receiver is winning before you throw it. You're just taking your drop. You're putting it up in the right spot. And what Derek said is he saw him kind of stuttering, thinking that was his release. But in reality, he was just kind of like hopping up and down because he was mad at himself. And so the throw went there anyway. But I think that would be the case. You're not bailing on the throw based on what the receiver is doing. You're throwing that ball.
Going through the motion, right?
So that's frustrating to see. I think there was a few others, but it all comes back to the same point. Is you look at this offense and you see potential and you see talent and you see chances and missed chances and missed opportunities, and you hear the same things week after week. And that's what Alvin's mad about. Like, that's what Alvin is talking about when he says this team talks a lot. They say they have to be better, but where are we getting better? And in that game specifically, it felt like he took a step back.
And once again, obviously, when you have these red zone issues, it's going to be brought up over and over and over. Why the heck you got Jimmy Graham on this roster when he is a red zone target, red zone specialist, whatever you want to consider him, yet you refuse to utilize him. And then on days during the week, like Wednesday, he pops up on an injury report with rest, and it's just insulting.
Or Jimmy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hopefully he's
got it. If you can catch a ball, you're in the lineup tonight.
Hopefully he's rested, because I think this is a week where you're gonna have to get something from somebody, and whether it's Jimmy, whether it's Jawan, whether it's Lynn, whether it's John Trey, I don't care. Marquez Callaway, better be ready.
Yeah, I mean, we might need Jawan to switch back to a wide receiver.
That's a good point. All right. Let's wrap up that segment. We will come back and talk about, what the few things that did work. There were a few positives that are worth pulling out of this game. And then we're going to kind of reset and say, okay, where are we in the standings? What does it look like? Do the Saints control their own destiny? Parentheses, yes, they do. And we'll talk about that. This is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He's Steve Geller. The dog is shaking around. I don't know if you heard that, but very, very annoyed at me.
I thought maybe is there a thunderstorm approaching?
No. There's a walk approaching that is a little behind schedule, and so I expect this last segment to be interrupted at least once. But we're gonna do it. We're gonna get it done. This is Inside Black and Gold again. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that. The Saints might let you down, but we probably will let you down too. That's okay. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to tell you things that aren't true. But all right, let's do it. And we're back on the Inside Black and Gold Saints support group podcast. Exactly. Let it all out. This is a safe space. Unless you're on Twitter, that is not a safe space.
They want to bury you on Twitter.
The night is dark and full of possums. Off target. We got this going. Anyway, this is the final segment of this podcast. We're going to do a short little segment on what went right, what did work in the Saints' loss to the Falcons. We spent a lot of time complaining, so I know that people think, oh, you're just all sunshine and rainbows and blah, blah, blah. And I just think that there's a point where you should you can't be all negative all the time. It's unhealthy. And if that's your goal in watching sports, then I don't know how to help you. And so I like to think that this podcast at least takes some time to say good job to some people. And then we'll continue and we'll talk about kind of, the Saints do control their own destiny, but it's a narrow road. So we're gonna get to that. But what did work? Not a lot. There wasn't a lot that went particularly well. But so first things first, Blake Grupe. It's easy to forget. You flash back to week 9, coming out of that Bears game, and all the talk is cut Blake Grupe. He's not good enough. He's trash. Get him out of here. You made a mistake. Should have been Will Lutz. And, he's a rookie. It's I get it. There's it's a production league, and but the team stuck with him, and he went to that game with a groin injury that cropped up late in the week.
That was so odd. He was still full of practice, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, kickers, what does it take to be full of practice? Right? You went there and you kicked.
I know, but when you hear a groin with the kicker, I was like, oh, shit, they're in trouble.
Yeah, well, it was a concern, and the Falcons were in the same boat. I was curious if that game came down to a long field goal for the Falcons, was Young Hui Koo capable of kicking a ball over 40 yards? I don't know if he was. But Blake, he went 5 for 5. He hit one from 52. He hit one from mid 40s. He basically hit a kick from every possible distance. Yeah. And I know that because I started him in fantasy. He got me 19 kicker points, and he could have been 24. That last kick, I don't know if he, I'd have to look and see. Maybe something went wrong in the operation. He clearly didn't get all of it. We know that he has the leg to get it from 54. But it just did not have the pop off the foot that would indicate that he got a full connection. And so it fell short. But that was you weren't winning that. I mean, it prevented your 0.03% onside kick opportunity chances with 28 seconds left to then try to get in the end zone. It didn't cost you much. Right. But I do think 5 for 5, starting that game 5 for 5 when the kicks actually mattered, which at that point I would argue that it didn't matter. It seemed like he also got onto the field. I think there was some confusion over whether you were going to kick it or not. I just think, it's not a bright spot you want to talk about coming out of a game where you didn't score any touchdowns, but in the reality where you need your kicker to be efficient and consistent and reliable, I think he deserves a little bit of credit after a really rough few games.
He was definitely in consideration for my post-game game ball. You can only give out one for the broadcast in the post-game show. I ended up giving it, to Matthew because of the 2 picks, but Grupe was right there. And obviously, you don't want to be gloating about 5 field goals, but shoot, without him making them, obviously you're in way dire straits than not. But I think, the best thing I'll take out of it is the fact you saw from the 30 range, 40, 50, you saw him be able to hit on all 3 levels, which is good, and getting that confidence back. I think at least that's there because you kind of worried that he was feeling a little shaky for a while.
Yeah, I mean, people wanted him to get – they wanted
right,
Robbie Gould is there, right? Go cut him and go sign. So, I mean, you can say, well, yeah, those you should make your kicks. But at the end of the day, he gave you a chance, right? He kept you in the game. If he misses 2 or 3 of those kicks, you think we're not talking about we need a new kicker? Of course you are. So just in the sense of that is one positive thing that happened in this game. Good.
Take it,
I'm just pointing to it. The other one you mentioned, another player that's on my list of stock up in terms of you needed someone to go out there and make big plays. You weren't stopping the run. The defensive line was not getting the job done. Someone had to go out there and make a play in a big moment. And Tyrann Mathieu, the first interception, it was kind of gift wrapped. I think it was a mistake. Desmond Ridder and the receivers were on the same page, and he airmailed it, and it kind of just caught Tyrann. But you can say, it's just a gift wrapped interception, but you see gift wrapped interceptions dropped all the time. So making a play on the ball, catching it, making sure that you secure the ball, and think about the interception that Marshawn Lattimore had against the Bears that got turned over because he put the ball on the ground. Like, these guys are defensive backs for a reason. So you give him credit there. The second one, I had a really good look at it. He was a blanket in coverage. And he said after the game, he was like, I was surprised that he even threw it because I was in perfect coverage. And he was like, thank you for throwing it. And, it's funny because I was watching it and I was like, wow, I can't believe he's throwing it there. And it was only a question of whether Tyrann would win the battle for the ball or if it would get knocked down, right? And he did, and he made a play when they desperately needed that play, and it set up what should have been a go-ahead drive. And so, yeah, like Tyrann, he's not the 2017 Tyrann. He's not this MVP caliber safety. Like, he's not primed Troy Polamalu, but he is a player in the secondary that is always in the right spot, has a nose for the ball, and makes big plays. And so, if you're trying to turn this season around, you're going to need more plays like that. And so I thought he was a bright spot too.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's just unfortunate when you see a performance like that get wasted kind of thing. But he tried his damnedest to get this team back in it.
I still think Marcus May is an issue. You saw a little bit more Jordan Howden. I think they were playing a little dime at the end. I think that I would like to see the Saints phase more Jordan Howden reps into the equation, however you do that. And he's a rookie, he's going to make mistakes. I just think athletically, I don't know if Marcus May ever got fully back from that calf, that Achilles injury or whatever he was dealing
with. That could still be hindering him, right?
You watch it athletically, I just don't see him able to cover in ways that you need him to. And, it wasn't his fault. We talked about pressure and adding more pressure, and that's used that touchdown to Bijan Robinson. When you send pressure, you isolate linebackers in coverage, you isolate safeties in coverage, and DeMario was in coverage. You get Bijan Robinson on a wheel route with DeMario Davis chasing him, and it's no disrespect for DeMario.
Right.
He's not winning that. Maybe he's not going to lose every time, but that's a big advantage for the Falcons when you can isolate that matchup. And it was a great throw. It was Ritter's best throw.
It really was. It sucked to be like, damn, that was good.
It was really good. It was so casual. He put it right in the perfect spot. Like, throwing to running backs isn't, it's one of the reasons is you don't see that many downfield throws to running backs is because they're not receivers. They're not wide receivers. So you got to put it in the right spot if you want to expect them to come down with it. And the Desmond did. He threw that ball on a dime.
Bijan unfortunately looks like he's going to be a problem for us in the coming years.
He's really freaking good.
Right.
He reminds me of Saquon, right? He's that same type of player where you can bottle him up all day long, and it just takes one. And I was honestly surprised that he didn't break one, because he was close a couple times, and they were able to just get him down, kind of with a last second like trip up, and he's that. It's funny. Like, the only negative I'll give for Bijan is the fact that he's on the Falcons, because teams like the Falcons don't need like they need players. Like, they need defensive linemen. They need offensive linemen. They don't need another playmaker. Like, you're already running Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson and Desmond Ridder. Like, you don't necessarily need that. Just like the Giants didn't need Saquon with over the hill Eli Manning. They needed an offensive line. And maybe a quarterback, right?
Well, a good thing too, from, I guess you would say, Falcons winning, it might give Arthur Smith a little more time.
Yeah. I was funny. I heard Bo Morgan on the broadcast before the game.
I was like, wow, he's double dipping.
Yeah.
And I didn't know his nickname was Squid Billy. That
that's
Bobby
his Twitter handle. That's his Twitter handle. Yeah. And I heard Bobby mention that like 7 times.
Yeah.
He kept saying it. He was like, hey, Squid. Anyway. One other thing, a couple others, and we'll get to them quick. We already talked a lot about Alvin Kamara. He had a great game.
Yeah.
Like, if this game goes a different way and the Saints find a way to pull it out, we're probably sitting here talking about that was one of Alvin's best games in a couple seasons, right? I think he had 119 total yards. He had 50 receiving yards on his 4 catches. Some screens worked. He made Caden Ellis look real bad in coverage a couple times. And it's just that's why you're talking about Alvin. You're like, why is he frustrated? Well, when you have a game like that, and you have an all-around game, when you impact the game like that,
Right. You're like, what else can I do?
right, exactly, and that's frustrating for him. But he had a very good game. A couple other guys, Lynn Bowden, right, like a guy kind of thrown into the action. He's your returner. It's one of the reasons it's funny because I projected him to be on the initial 53-man roster, and when they cut him, I was like, oh, maybe I was off. Maybe I kind of read that incorrectly, but they brought him back real quick, right? Like they like him. And they like what he's able to do. And part of the reason I thought they probably want to keep him around is because of that return ability. He's going to be your backup punt returner. I don't know about kick returner. I think they had Taysom in there. But that's something. He had a couple really nice runs. He does things. He's going to be a guy who you can use to fill some of the Rashid Shaheed plays in the playbook, right? Like not necessarily downfield because I hate to say it, but his hands are basically bricks. The hands are not good, but he's athletic. He's able to do things. He might throw pass, right? He can throw. He was a quarterback at one point in college, I think, at Kentucky. And so, yeah, it's good for him. Juwan Johnson, I thought had a decent game. The offensive line, I thought, blocked pretty well.
Yeah, was hoping to see Juwan get a little more involved, but yeah, it was
well now.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I felt I've been waiting to see more and more from him, obviously, but I think you could say a lot of that for a lot of folks on the offense. Like this week, obviously, I'm sure Jamal Williams, revenge week, we'll be talking.
That's true. I forgot about that. It's funny, Juwan, the timing of his concussion check is very frustrating because like you wanted him on the field. Like once Chris Olave went out, like your options are limited. And Juwan, who didn't have a concussion, but missed several key snaps as he was getting evaluated. And he ended up having to go back in the locker room. He came back, but yeah, you didn't have him during some key moments there. But yeah, I think that's about it from me. The one other thing we can mention, I thought the corners played reasonably well. I think we might have talked about that already. Ike Adam, Paulson Adebo, those are going to be your corners for the next few weeks. So yeah, you better get used to it.
Yeah, because the Lattimore going to IR kind of snuck on there on Saturday right before the game.
Yeah, and I don't think that's particularly a surprise. Like DA, if they had not ruled that out as of Wednesday, and that's it was pretty clear that they were still evaluating, and the deadline to get him on IR and still be eligible to come back week 16, which 4 weeks away is week 16, that was Saturday, and so they had to make that decision. So he's not coming back till week 16 at the earliest. Cam Dantzler was signed to the active roster, so he is out there. He was wearing a Marshawn Lattimore t-shirt in warmups. But yeah, it's there's going to be a lot to talk about with the Lions. Going to be a lot to talk about with Dan Campbell coming back to town. Aaron Glenn, the second defensive coordinator in a row that is a former Saints assistant, and definitely knows the team he's going to be going against pretty well. Although he's at least a couple more years removed.
Hey, I'm trying to think too, player-wise. Do they have anybody else besides Anzalone? I can't think of anyone off the top of my head.
Well, they have CJ, but I don't think he's on IR.
Right. Oh man, thank God we're not seeing CJ.
Teddy Bridgewater.
Oh, that's right.
He's a backup.
Teddy time.
Teddy two gloves. I'm sure Sam Laporta will have a massive game, but he is not a former Saint.
Got to watch out for Jamar Gibbs, obviously, too.
They have Julian Aquara and Romeo Aquara. Let's see. That's it on the active roster. CJ is on injured reserve, obviously. And then the P squad. That's it. Yeah. So just Anzalone and then Teddy. Those are going to be the guys you see. They have just as many assistant coaches as they have former Saints players, which is surprising. You'd think they would have a couple, but
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, Aaron Glenn's, I know, someone that will get head coaching calls or at least interviews for plenty of open jobs that are coming.
he has been. Yeah. So let's just close this out just because we promised. So the Saints do control their own destiny. I had a few people tell me that they don't, because if the Falcons and Saints both win out, the Saints that the Falcons would have a better record than the Saints.
That would be true if that was possible.
It's true. They would win the tiebreaker. The problem is the Saints and Falcons can't both win out. And so you're talking, like the difference comes in the margin, right? Like if you had won that game, you've been 2 games up. And so you could afford to lose this game to the Lions, for example, because
Right.
you're not going to be, the Lions are going to be favored. This is going to be, well, I think the Saints actually do match up here much better than people are going to give them credit for. This is going to be a very difficult game to win. And in order to say you control your own destiny now, that's the difference. To say you control your own destiny now, you have to beat the Lions. If you had beaten the Falcons, you could say we control our own destiny and we have baked in some wiggle room if we could afford to lose this game. Now you cannot say that. But once you get past this game, you end up with you end up with Carolina, who just fired their head coach. Maybe they get better. Probably not. You're probably going to.
This is the stretch now. Bam, bam, bam. Three straight at home, for crying out loud.
3 straight at home, right? So you get Carolina at home. Then you get the Giants at home, which
Danny DeVito.
The Danny DeVito show. I'm glad we got Bobby saying Danny DeVito now too. Did he come up with that on his own, or did you tell him?
No, I didn't tell him. So he just came up with Danny DeVito.
Me and Bobby are on the same
wavelength. Same wavelength.
Well, because Tommy DeVito, it's funny because Tommy DeVito is the guy from Goodfellas.
Oh, okay, that's right. Joe Pesci's character. Yeah.
So
you think I'm funny like a clown?
Yeah. Right. But I think Danny DeVito is way funnier than any Goodfellas references.
Well, they just won an ugly ass game, and I could expect that kind of matchup against the freaking Saints.
They've won 2 games in a row, and so one thing, you look at these games at the end of the year and you say, well, some of these teams are going to be tanking, right? Some of these teams are going to be like, we're fucked. Like we're done. We're dead in the water. We're going to go to backups. We're not, you're not going to see guys playing hard. The Giants are still playing hard. So that's not going to be a walkover game now. And neither will Carolina, because Carolina has no reason to tank because they don't have a first round pick.
Oh, that's so sad.
Like if Carolina had their first round pick and they were on track to be the number 1 pick in the draft, then you probably would see them tank. But there's no reason to now. So
there's players and coaches fighting for jobs.
Yeah, you're gonna at least get a representative effort out of them, and it's a divisional game. They're gonna fight hard, so those games won't be walkovers. But then Rams, who knows,
playing a hell of a lot better
by that point. Bucks, I think it's possible you see Kyle Trask in that game. I think Baker's dealing with an injury. So we'll see.
I know he got hurt and came back last game.
Yes, yeah, he did. And either way, you're talking week 17 for a team that feels like they're headed in the very opposite direction of where
they started.
The Saints and Falcons are trying to go, right? Like I think you might see the team that does own its first round pick and feels like it's in the running for one of these top quarterbacks, right? Yeah, you might see them do what you kind of expected all season, which is just phone it in. But and then so you have Atlanta after that. Now, if you want to look on the other side and see Atlanta's schedule,
it's pretty easy.
Obviously, they have the only team with an easier schedule than the Saints is the Falcons, and part of that's because the Falcons play the Saints twice. So their schedule is just as easy, right? So you're talking Jets, Bucks, then Panthers. Now they have the Colts in Atlanta. That's going to be a game where you at least look at it and say, okay, that the Bucks or the Colts are a good offense.
Right. The opponent is at least going to give up a fight.
Right. Whereas like the Jets with Tim Boyle, who, ugly.
I don't know how the freaking Jets beat the Eagles this year.
Because weird stuff happens.
Exactly.
Right? You look at the Eagles and they're what,
10-1?
9-1? What are the Eagles? 10-1?
Yeah, 10-1.
They're 10-1, and their only loss is to the Zach Wilson
Jets. Right. What?
Uh,
Makes no sense.
no. And so like both of these teams are probably feel like we need to win the next 5 games so we can get to that week 18 matchup. And what this loss for the Saints did is it means, you probably lose that tiebreaker if you do end with the same record. And you obviously could end with the same record if, for example, the Saints go out and lose to the Lions and then win their next 4, and the Falcons win their next 5 games. And then I think you would get into that game and it would come down to division record. And if that's the case, the Falcons would win that tiebreaker. And so
Right.
you be like that. The biggest difference is it's not necessarily that the Saints don't control their own destiny. It just means that they have no wiggle room left. In order to say they control their own destiny, they have to win this week. Otherwise, you will need at least 1 loss from the Falcons. And that's not where you want to be. It's not where you should be. It's not where you thought you would be, but that's where you are. And, this team is going to say, hey, we can go out and win our final 6 games and get to the postseason. But you got to go do it. And, I have not seen anything over the last month that would lead me to believe this team is on the verge of making a run. But for the purposes of saying the Saints still control what they can control, and it's not you're going to win out and still miss the playoffs. Like if you win out, you make the playoffs. That's where you're at.
Yeah, and I know a lot of folks probably want to know why aren't we talking about, the firing of anybody. I think we've talked about it enough. Honestly, it's like we already feel like this organization is not going to make any in-season changes. Nothing so drastic. It would have to be, I guess, the Saints drop on, I don't know how many more in a row that you would make. You would think some kind of drastic move would come.
Yeah, I mean, if you get eliminated from the playoffs, then
All bets
sure,
are
like
off.
you might see something. You might see some moves. But again, like this late in the season, you're not making any tangible changes that are going to really affect anything in a positive way.
No, it's
right?
like that to me is the question too. When people say, "Why don't you fire Dennis Allen?" It's like, all right, who's taking over for him then? Who's the interim even?
Right. It's probably Pete.
There is no way in hell it's going to be Pete.
Maybe Joe Woods. I don't know.
I was thinking maybe Marone just because he's been there before.
It probably would be Marone.
I don't know, but I don't know, right?
That wouldn't be better. It's yeah. And so like you're looking at it and saying, okay, what can you do the rest of the way? If you go out and you lose your next 3 games, and it's funny because it's like I just don't think, like, even if you do plan to fire people in the offseason, it does not benefit you to do it early unless you have to, because here's the thing. You get rid of the coach and you get rid of that support system, and who knows what happens. Like you don't like you're talking about a very combustible room of people that you need to at least be pulling in the same direction for the final few games, regardless of whether you're in contention or not. Like you need a guy who's going to lead the team and go out there and get the job done. And you remove that, and that throws a whole lot of variables into the equation. You got young players, like you look at the stuff like Chris Olave getting arrested for speeding. Like, just these are young guys. These are players that you need to keep, at least pointed in the right direction, and to this point, I think you've seen DA be effective in that, right? Like you haven't seen any, blow ups or anything like that. Like the closest thing has been Alvin kind of speaking his mind, and that's just Alvin. He would have done that whether Sean was here or not.
I mean, I guess you could. I don't know if you count like Carr's temper tantrum.
Yeah, but like Carr. It's funny because Carr has been kind of subdued. It's very clear that he's made a decision to be a positive influence. He said that, and it's like it is funny because you did have that stretch. You remember we were talking about how he was blowing up on Chris and Pete on the sideline. He hasn't really done that. But we haven't seen the offense be good since then. So maybe it's time for him to get mad again. I don't know. But yeah, like
someone's got to get angry, right? Damn.
Yeah, like we were talking about coming in, like you fire Frank Reich. I imagine we're gonna learn more about this firing in the coming days, and I guarantee you that the whole CJ Stroud, Bryce Young thing drove a wedge between he and David Tepper. And
Massive. Absolutely.
when that working relationship becomes untenable, you don't fire the owner, you fire the coach. And I don't think that Gale and DA are having any issues. I don't think Mickey and DA are having any issues. The issues are the production. And you're going to get to the end of the season, you're going to make that decision. I would love for it to be a playoff run. Like, I'm not ever going to be one of those people who is rooting for a team to lose to just so people get fired. I'm always going to land on the rosy side of that picture, and a turnaround where everything starts going great and they get on a run and they make it to the playoffs, and they, even if they lose, like, I'm never going to root against that. That's just not me. That's not how I choose to go about my fanhood and my football viewing. And part of it's because I grew up watching Giants, and I've watched that happen, and I know how that can turn out when it does happen. But I'm not telling you that's likely. So
we're not, jinxing for Jaden or anything. We're not tanking for Jaden.
Jinxing for Jaden. That
didn't really work. It just,
I think we got to go back to the drawing board on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Jonesing for Jaden, better than jinxing at the very least.
He gets the red shirt year under Derek Carr to learn, and then bam, there you go. Solutions.
Well, so that is one thing, and we can talk about that. So you talk about changes. You talk about, when I say one and done in terms of the project with Derek Carr, you look at it and you say, well, what does that mean? How do you get out from under Derek Carr? And to me, I don't think you're going to find a trade partner for him. Maybe if you do, but you're still paying. Like, you're not really saving money in that front. And I think you're probably going to move on. Like, I don't think you're bringing Jameis back next year. And so what a one and done could look like is, if you do move on from, at the very least, Pete Carmichael, and you install a new offensive scheme, right? You bring in a young, a Joe Brady, right? You bring in somebody who, you expect to revamp this offensive system, and you say, okay, Derek, you got 1 year. Let's see what you can do. But you also go out and you draft whoever that offensive coordinator, you draft their quarterback. You draft the guy that they love, that they want to work with in the long run. And so you still have Derek Carr. You look at the Titans, right? You look at how they operated this year under Ryan Tannehill, and then, they turned to Will Levis, and he looks really good, and they're going to keep going with him. But it was never a planned thing of, we're going to draft Will Levis and he's going to take over for Ryan. It was, we're going to see what happens with Ryan and go from there. Right. And to me, that's how you kind of approach it. If you do, if your offense does not turn a corner and you kind of see the writing on the wall, and you make some changes, whether it's DA or whether it's just the offense, I think that's one way you can handle it in terms of splitting the difference of, you owe Derek Carr this money and you do need a starting quarterback. You're not going to have a top 5 pick where you can go get a Caleb Williams and say that's our week 1 starter. And frankly, I've said this before. I don't think starting a rookie week 1 is the answer. So you can maybe, who falls to 16, 18, right? Like, who is that end of first round guy where you're looking at a Kenny Pickett, right? Or whoever it is, right? Can you find a guy and develop them? And then maybe week 12, if things don't work out with the offense as a whole, and you start the clock, right? You start the clock fresh with a young guy. To me, that is a palatable kind of solution to the Derek Carr question. Now, if Derek comes out the last 5 games and blows up and suddenly, like, man, great, no one would be happier in terms of, I would just love to watch fun football games. That's all I want. I just want to have a good time watching football games. And right now I'm not.
This offense is not making it fun at all again. It's like, what the hell?
Right. Make football fun again. Right.
Yes.
Anyway, that's where I'm at. And so this has been a 90-minute, I feel like we have too many of these therapy sessions.
That's the Saints' fault. That's why we're all in therapy.
Yes. Inside Black and Gold, the podcast you go to cry.
Let it out.
Angry cries, angry tears. But all right, that's going to wrap up this episode. We'll be back on Wednesday, injury report edition, like we do with the road weeks. But we're
Fingers
going to get
crossed
into
with
home games.
Olave.
And we're going to get into home games. So
Yes.
we'll be able to at least get into a more reasonable post-game edition schedule, which feels like we've had no home games this year because one of them was a Thursday. And one of them was week. Well, it feels like me personally, I didn't get to go to week 1. So,
and then, I mean, and just in general, I don't know what it is. These weeks, I mean, Minnesota following the bye week, that seems like eons ago already.
It does. It does. And every day is a new challenge to not be depressed.
I'm going to try and stay positive. Like I said, my big one right now is please, Chris Olave, get through that concussion protocol and be able to play this week because we definitely need it.
Yes, I agree. Anyway, this is Inside Black and Gold. Thanks everyone who listened. Thanks everyone who subscribes. If you haven't subscribed, go subscribe. Leave us a rating. Leave us a review. Do your thing. Thanks everyone for listening all the way to the end. I'm amazed that you got here, but we did it together. We will talk later in the week. Who dat? That was a bad who dat. I kind of said who that. Who dat? Go Saints. It's kind of your moment. I always leave that space for you to shine.
Who dat?
All right. Be easy, y'all. Peace.